Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Slowik. Joe. Yeah, put your hands together. Come on.
Thanks, Dave. This thing, it says it's on. Is this coming through in a recording somewhere?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. I will hold it distressingly close to my mouth for the next speaker. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Slowik. Currently, I run threat research and cyber engineering for Dataminr. Been there for a little over a year. I've also been at Dragos, MITRE, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and other places. Been doing this sort of stuff for 15 years. And today we're going to talk about something I've been digging into for the last 3 or 4 years, or at least elements of it. And I apologize. It says residential proxies in the agenda. We will talk to residential proxies, but really we're talking more proxy networks in general and how these are being leveraged for enabling attacks on critical national infrastructure. So our agenda is, we'll talk about botnets to kick things off, because it's really where this all originates. And you might be saying, like, I'm a professional in this space. I know what the hell a botnet is, Joe. Why are we talking about it? Which is why we're not going to spend too much time on it. But then we'll get into how this sort of network architecture has enabled certain types of attack on critical systems historically, and then pivot into what the state of the now is when it comes to adversaries, especially higher end adversaries like your Volt Typhoons of the world, are doing in order to enable initial access, exploitation activity, as well as subsequent command and control. We'll then conclude with some thoughts on responses and countermeasures, which start to get a little sticky based upon the nature of these nodes and assets, and then some concluding thoughts about where this places us today and what we can meaningfully do and what we maybe meaningfully cannot do with respect to this problem. So first, botnets. We're familiar with botnets. They've been around for decades at this point. And simplistically, it's a system system of compromised machines, generally operating at a fairly single layer, where you have a controlling server or a telegram channel or something similar that receives messages from and sends messages to compromised devices that then execute some sort of action, ranging from things like spam to DDoS, traffic proxying potentially, etc. Not terribly interesting or technically sophisticated, but it works. And so we still see botnets being leveraged for lots of different uses today. What's interesting about botnets, though, and what will be a central thesis of this discussion, is where these items reside. Because the core tenet of a botnet, and certainly as we start getting into more complex architectures like proxy networks or operational relay boxes, which is a name I absolutely detest for reasons that I can tell you aside later, but anyway, is the use of intermediaries that are neither adversary space nor victim space, almost like a victim of convenience that enables these operations to take place, a sort of neutral space when it comes to adversary architectures. And the question is, what do you do about this neutral space, and how does that influence how we interact with these items as being amplification points for or redirection points for malicious activity and similar? Because we can look at very prominent cases. Mirai has been around for 10 years old now. So Mirai is more than just a toddler at this point. It is soon going to be able to drive, I suppose, or at least its underlying code base will be. Mirai is an Internet of Things botnet, has had various permutations to it, but the code base is public. You can download it from GitHub. And as a result, certain functionality, especially the DDoS activity and similar, has been incorporated into items that extend to current operations today. So these things, again, they're not technically advanced like we might think about certain advanced malware and similar, but they do just work and enable certain types of events that can be a little interesting. So let's do a really quick history lesson on state-directed botnet activity, particularly focusing on aspects to critical national infrastructure, not necessarily OT-based, but certainly involving systems of national importance. So first off, there's this assumption that botnets are a cyber criminal thing, like, oh, I extort you for money, and as a result or whatever, if you don't pay me 0.2 Bitcoin or something like that, I'm going to take down your website for a prolonged period of time. Yes, but botnets have been leveraged going back to sort of the history of the early days of cyber warfare for various things. So for example, Georgia and Estonia, going back to 2008, 2009 timeframe, the initial, or 2007, 2008 timeframe, sort of the initial cyber warfare campaigns, which combined, in the case of Georgia, very physical warfare elements. Estonia, not so much, but leveraged traffic amplification through a combination of both compromised devices and sort of patriotic botnets, people willingly contributing assets, and then targeting things like government websites, critical national infrastructure, financial sector, etc., to bring them down. Not, again, the most technically sophisticated sort of thing to do in the world, but if you're talking about on the cusp of or in parallel to a invasion scenario, can definitely lead to an amplification of attacks and lead to civic unrest, civic uncertainty, and similar. Less well discussed, Operation Ababil. Ababil is in the news again for various reasons, most war crime potentially among other things, but this was an event that took place in 2012 during one of many rounds of US-Iranian tensions, and was an attack against the US financial sector that took place over a prolonged period of time that was interesting in the architecture of this botnet, in that instead of relying on mass in terms of number of machines roped into a botnet, instead focused on high bandwidth, high throughput servers that were compromised and then leveraged as part of the campaign to then bring down the public portals for multiple financial institutions. Again, not the most sophisticated thing in the world, but effective in costing millions of dollars in terms of both downtime as well as the subsequent remediation and such, which for DDoS is typically throw more money at the problem and it goes away. Now, the important element about this in terms of operational commonalities is that we see indirect use of capabilities largely around political messaging and other purposes, or to add an extra layer to other sorts of events that are going on, and disruptive but not destructive in nature. We'll come back to how this may be shifting as these architectures have gotten more complex, but also it's important to note there was really a lack of response or retaliation for these activities. Operation Ababil was interesting because given the nature of that botnet, that there weren't as many devices, you could have maybe done something like a forced remediation campaign, if you're familiar with some of these items. But generally speaking, it becomes difficult to try to tackle these items at scale because, you know, like Hydra cut off one head, two more shall take its place, etc. So makes counter botnet operations difficult with an asterisk, as we'll come back to this momentarily. So state-sponsored DDoS activity and similar is really more cyber network annoyance as opposed to cyber war, but very much shows interest in leveraging botnets for malicious purposes. But what if we could take things a bit more advanced and look for other opportunities of leveraging these sorts of proxy networks, leveraging or compromising neutral space in order to facilitate or enable offensive operations? That gets us to the state of the now. Proxy networks and how these relate to and are enabling offensive operations that are leading to rather concerning instances of critical infrastructure breaches. So first, enter the orb, the operational relay box proxy network. I've seen some other ways of referring to this as well, but we'll say proxy network just for simple, to make this simple. The main shift from a classic botnet is an increase in architectural complexity, where we're talking about multiple layers of devices through which, almost like you see with the onion router or similar sorts of networks, traffic can be routed and rerouted through multiple nodes within the network, such that tracing traffic back to its origin becomes exceptionally difficult, not impossible. The folks at Lumen do this quite effectively, but they also own the backbone, so they have really good visibility. But allows for multiple advantages compared to both direct C2. I lease a couple virtual private servers and I use them for my attack, or I use a botnet. Instead, this becomes a much more robust architecture in terms of I can remove several of these nodes, but it is immaterial because traffic will simply route around them, as well as leading to greater operational security, leading to issues around attribution, if you care about such things, and similar. In thinking about this in the context of a neutral web space, there is a significant expansion and use of neutral devices to make these things happen. So thinking about a Mirai-like architecture of having lots of Internet of Things devices, network-facing appliances, and similar, but doing them at a scale that allows for this to, you know, create quite complex and quite extensive networks in multiple tiers that allow for these benefits in terms of traffic security and operational security. What we often see in constructing these, as we'll get to things like Volt Typhoon, looking at examples that may have been used for this, like the ScanV project associated with the Vulkan files or Vulkan leaks, are things like +1 day vulnerabilities, occasionally 0 days, but not usually. Lots of default credentials and similar fairly simplistic mechanisms, but that again scale quite well, that allow for rapid identification, compromise, and then installation of whatever software is being used in order, or similar, in order to allow for that proxy network to function. The result is that of all this is that takedowns and similar require pretty thorough interaction with this neutral space in order to counter proxy network operations. How do I actually take this down requires interacting with someone's small office, home office router or network device, or their IP camera, or someone's VPN concentrator, or similar, which leads to lots of questions in terms of how do we actually respond to these that we'll come back to in our concluding thoughts. As far as examples are concerned, these are not new. The idea of a orb network, even the term orb, is quite old if you've worked in certain parts in the greater capital region, but has become quite popular in the last couple of years around mostly People's Republic of China cyber operations, Flax Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, etc. But what's interesting in looking at these items is that we're also seeing a significant division of labor in how they're created. So for example, KV botnet, which we'll talk to here in a couple of slides, is strongly associated with Volt Typhoon operations and intrusions. However, Volt Typhoon neither manages nor owns the KV botnet. Instead, what we see are a number of PRC-related entities, contractors, and similar, that create these proxy networks and then lease access to them, again, creating a degree of separation, deniability, but also meaning that one proxy network can be leveraged by multiple threat actors, further muddying the attribution space and our ability to definitively tie a given campaign based upon traffic analysis or similar to a definitive adversary or objective. Now, prior to, I'll just say the orb paper. So Mike Raggy, who I think is at CrowdStrike now, but when he was still at Mandiant, popularized the term and largely in conjunction with Chinese operations. But prior to that, we had a bridge campaign, I would say, that was Russia affiliated in terms of VPN filter and then its follow-on payload of Cyclops Blink. These malware families went after a variety of networking devices in order to create a not more advanced than a botnet, but not quite as complex as what we've seen with like a KV botnet or similar proxy network associated with the Typhoon operations. But doing so in a way that would allow for DDoS activity, but also traffic shaping, command and control, and similar things that were thought to be linked to operations in Ukraine and potentially elsewhere. These operations were disrupted with partial success. If you talk to folks at like Trend Micro or Trend AI, whatever the hell they're calling themselves these days, they still identify VPN filter and Cyclops Blink infections today because remediation of these devices requires not just apply a patch or remove the implant or whatever, but also restart the device, make a configuration change, etc. So there's a lack of permanence to some of the takedown efforts. So while these were never really successful in any publicly known intrusion or attack scenario, they definitely show that while we talk about the orb networks and similar in a strongly Chinese context, other adversaries have been documented using elements of this as well. We don't have time to get into other possibilities, like I said, with the ScanV framework from the Vulkan files, but if you're interested in that, let me know. I did a talk at DEF CON on that a couple of years ago. But what you're probably familiar with, and probably why you're in this session today, the link to the Typhoons. PRC operators have been extremely proficient and very happy to leverage proxy networks to enable intrusions. So we are at critical effect. If I don't mention Volt Typhoon and how it's the biggest risk to critical national infrastructure, Josh Corman will run through that door and smack me. So there you go, Josh, I did it. But anyway, the core proposition here is that Volt Typhoon has leveraged these proxy networks to essentially evade most types of indicator-based tracking, filtering, and defense, facilitating not just initial access activity in terms of target identification and exploitation, but also subsequent command and control and similar activities. Now, we don't have time for this because it's a very short presentation. Everyone talks about the great mysteries of Volt Typhoon and how stealthy they are. You can find them if you know what you're looking for. It's not magic. But it does make things substantially more difficult, and especially when we start talking about the nature of a lot of the victims that Volt Typhoon is going after, at least after their initial identification and targeting Guam and or the Guam Electric Power and similar entities back in 2022 and such. So strong use of these networks in order to facilitate operations at scale, and not just Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon also very well noted and the subject of a takedown operation for the use of proxy networks, as well as multiple other PRC actors that all sort of work in this web, very proxy network like, of proxy network providers and then proxy network consumers. What's important to note about all this is that they provide a survivable C2 framework that evades easy takedown. For example, botnets, you could probably, there have been academic and real life examples of initiating vaccines or counter botnet operations, either at the controller level or similar, in order to neuter their operations. Proxy networks make this substantially more difficult in that the actual controllers are far more obfuscated and hardened, and then leading into those tiered networks of multiple devices make any single payload to try to take all these elements down simultaneously not impossible, but very difficult. This nested capability evades easy remediation, and there may be significant advantages, not just for operational security. I avoid Google Threat Intel or whatever giving me a APT number or whatever because they can't figure out who I am, so I'm one of their innumerable UNCs and such. But also could be very interested when it comes to contested operations. So we're thinking about attacks on critical national infrastructure here. Presumably as part of that, we're talking about a scenario where conflict is going on if it's open season on the US electric or water sector. Well, as part of that, how would we defend against that, even from a more defend forward or offensive operation perspective, if you're trying to SWAT at tens, hundreds of thousands of devices through which traffic can be directed in order to attack these devices, becomes a substantially more difficult proposition than just like block the bad IPs or filter all traffic coming from this country. An emerging aspect of this as well are residential proxies. So show of hands, who reads the EULA for every little app or service that you install on your phone, smart TV, or similar? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so combination of both dodgy apps as well as some things legitimate in a lot of the IoT ecosystem in which users inadvertently or sometimes even deliberately become part of proxy networks that then get leased out to adversaries for activities ranging from crypto mining to actual cybercrime or other offensive operations. This is a thorny issue because from a legal perspective, like I'm voluntarily doing this. Are you going to take down my smart TV because I'm running an app, or how does this work? And how do I prosecute the people that are providing access to these items when users that are part of these networks have willingly, by clicking the box saying, I accept the terms, entered into these environments? Very thorny issue. It's becoming more of an issue over the last couple of years where, and is going to make for thornier questions as far as takedown and remediation are concerned, but not something that's been extended into efforts like what we've seen for critical national infrastructure attacks yet. But a lot of the lessons that we'll talk about in terms of defense and remediation are going to be very applicable for this as well. So combination of compromise and backdoor items that are controlled to produce a type of proxy network, and we're talking about these residential proxies, and can be exceptionally difficult to remediate both in terms of technical options as well as legal authorities to do so, given their nature. We can come back to that in a bit. All right, so big problem. We have adversaries like our big nasty Volt Typhoon or whatever that are leveraging these proxy networks in order to facilitate operations targeting critical national infrastructure. It's not just Volt Typhoon that's doing this. We see other adversaries learning about this as well and migrating operations towards less easily tracked, much more difficult to defend network postures. So what do we do about this? Well, you could take I referenced this already. Again, this is Raggy's paper from a couple years ago about IOC extinction. We can't throw up our hands and say like, well, we're screwed. So I guess we just, don't bother anymore. That's not what Mike actually argued in this paper. Rather, the sensible thing that we have to adopt more behavior-based approaches to defense, and indicator-based approaches when it comes to these proxy networks are essentially useless except for forensic and maybe walking back networks in order to try to determine what is the architecture of or the status of a given proxy network. But for forward-leaning defense, absolutely useless. We have seen takedowns, though, a couple of different types. So also one that affected APT28 on, why do I forget right now? That was the Ubiquity devices, if I recall correctly. But anyway, we've seen this against both Chinese, Russian, and similar sorts of networks that takedown operations do occur and appear to be successful for a bit. But the thing is, success is often uneven or even outright ephemeral. These things get taken down and they roar right back, either with slight modification or even in the same form and status that they were to begin with. So the folks at Lumen have done excellent work. In fact, they just published a blog on the JBY botnet, which is an evolution of the KV botnet, last week. So if you're interested in this subject, I recommend reading that article. But we see these items reemerge, even things like VPN filter that were pretty thoroughly dealt with and understood, because the ultimate solution to these sorts of problems is patch your device, change credentials, restart it, and similar, that are often either not applicable or rest in the hands of these owners of neutral devices that need to take some positive action in order to actually close off the vulnerability or the ingress route for adversaries to leverage these devices. So for example, this is from the KV botnet takedown, that the court authorized steps to disconnect the routers from the botnet and prevent reinfection are temporary in nature. A router's owner can reverse these mitigation steps by restarting the router. So copy start run, or similar, and it's all blown away. Expecting, depending on the nature of these devices, to have everyday consumers go and patch their smart IP camera, smart device, small office, home office router, replace an end-of-life router or similar. Ideal, yes. Likely, in all cases, certainly not. And that leads to a problem that persists well beyond what we would be comfortable with. So what do we do then? Well, indicator blocking, we talked like absolutely out of the question. Aggressive network takedowns, maybe. Maybe by tracing these things back through appropriate analysis of net flow and similar, we can identify controllers and engage in offensive cyber operations against those directly and cut these off at the root. That seems provocative because now you're talking about entering into very much adversary space. So probably an option in case of outright conflict, but for more lower level pre-positioning sorts of events where the rules are a little less clear, probably a little more provocative than we would like. More interesting, in my opinion, is forced victim patching and greater interaction with this neutral web. Like, okay, if the root problem of all this is all this internet of crap stuff that keeps getting reinfected and roped into these networks, why don't we address this at its root cause and take care of that? Well, what happens when the forced patch or the remediation effort, yeah, it's successful 98% of the time, but 2% of the time it results in a device bricking itself or something along those lines because of a bit flip or something else along the way. Well, that's going to piss people off. Who pays for that? But not only that, in terms of authorities, what happens when that device isn't in the US, but is in Canada or in Uganda or somewhere else? Can the FBI then engage in those operations? Well, they can if they engage in some partnership with the local jurisdiction, but is that necessarily doable, feasible? Is it fast enough to actually allow for organizations, law enforcement, military, or otherwise, to combat these items? I would argue probably not, at least not in the current state of things, but certainly something that probably needs to be considered. I just want to emphasize, though, because we still see indicators being shared for these items, that it's just simply a non-starter as far as action is concerned. That the sheer size of these networks make it just not even reasonable to interact with these devices at that scale, but also in terms of relevance and impermanence, the items just aren't the core issue that we're dealing with in terms of C2 or initial access channels, because they will rotate and change quite quickly. It is basically, trying to race the Red Queen. We might get halfway, but we're never ever going to overtake her in this race. So for defensive purposes, less ideal. for research and forensic purposes, still necessary in order to be able to dig into these environments and figure out how they're being constructed, what devices are being targeted, what payloads are being used to create these items. But that's not what your local water utility cares about. Might be what the NSA cares about or Cyber Command, but certainly not the people who are on the front lines of these intrusions. So what do we need for a response then? Well, for one, try to deal with the issue in terms of how it manifests. Greater attack or better attack surface management to cut off the ability of adversaries to leverage these networks to impact us in the first place. Oh, just patch it. Adopt good cyber hygiene, right? Well, we say this every time I'm at one of these damn conferences, and we're still saying the same damn thing. So while it is great advice and everyone should do it, it ain't happening anytime soon either. Proxy network tracking and takedown is necessary to understand the scope and scale of the problem, but it's not going to solve it on its own. So we need to engage with these environments to figure out what's happening, but that alone is not going to be sufficient in order to deal with the underlying issue and the risks that they pose. Preventing rebuild is where we really need to be, but that starts getting us into those thorny questions of who is the authority to do what to someone's private property that is hanging off the internet and is being used by a state-sponsored adversary to threaten critical national infrastructure and such. How does that interact with ostensibly neutral space on the internet? So let's think about this. So say we have a destructive campaign. Volt Typhoon goes active. Taiwan is invaded. It's 2029 because I don't think 27 is going to be it. So put this out a few years. And we start seeing impacts in the US in terms of outages and similar. And all of these commands to latent dormant implants and such are being sent via compromised C2 nodes for these proxy networks. So the response here clearly calls for some sort of countermeasure. Offensive cyber is in the cards, folks, because we're at war. Well, all known identified nodes enabling the campaign are these neutral web entities, and many of them are in other countries. So how can the government prosecute these nodes to mitigate an in-progress attack without causing other problems or opening up a whole different can of worms? Now, probably in that case, because it is an emergency, especially under a maximum lethality mindset or whatever, people probably wouldn't care and just do things. But ideally, we would have some plan worked out in order to figure out, well, how do we actually respond to this in a way that appreciates and understands timeliness and the efficacy or lack thereof for certain approaches of dealing with these environments. So I have a couple of minutes concluding thoughts. First, it is given adversaries are moving towards more complicated, more complex network architectures to enable operations, and defenders need to keep pace, but also think about countermeasures to reduce or eliminate the threat. Available options to curtail proxy networks, they certainly exist, but they really test or stress what we see in terms of existing authorities, operations, and mindsets. We just don't have the tools or at least as far as I can tell, the doctrine that in order to really go after these things in a way that would matter. But also this willingness of adversaries to weaponize the neutral space is a real pain in the ass because solutions to these items are generally going to step into thorny ethical and legal grounds. But also, failure to address these items means allowing adversaries free rein to operate in this space with potentially quite dramatic implications for the security and reliability of critical national infrastructure. But also, we can flip this on its head a little bit, and this is something I'm going to talk about in Vegas at DEF CON and B-Sides or whatever. Do we have responsibilities that are being shirked as part of this entire process? Why is it that I am allowed to plug whatever the hell I want into the greater internet, the global internet, and I have no responsibility for maintaining the security or the posture of that device, allowing people to rope it into some malicious environment? Should there be like a driver's license for network connectivity or, vehicle safety standards for these devices? Maybe. We certainly are very, very far from ever even closely enacting, let alone enforcing such a thing. But between the proxy network and certainly the emerging residential proxy network issue, we might have to start thinking of ways of dramatically restricting freedom of ownership and operation for these things, given the risk that they might pose overall to society. So again, short talk. If you want to learn more about this, I wrote a paper that's hosted on the Dataminr website. You may have to give up your email address in order to get it. If you'd rather not do that, just send me a message and I'll give you a copy because I'm like that. I'll go back to that if anyone. Okay, got a couple cameras. And the last slide is just my contact info. Yep.
Okay. We have time for one or two questions from Mr. Slowik. I see a question. Okay.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for bringing this up. This is an increasingly growing problem, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on. So, we keep seeing more and more Android TVs and Android setup boxes coming pre-infected with malware. I mean, it's you buy them off of Amazon, and they already come pre-infected. They belong to a botnet, so a residential proxy botnet. So this makes things really hard because it's not a vulnerability they have.
Yep.
They get compromised somewhere in the middle of
Yep.
between the vendor and the consumer. So I guess two questions. One is how do we fight this effectively? And two is imagine your scenario where the government, state of war, whatever, decides, okay, we're going to take out the TVs because they are amplifying some attacks. I mean, it's it's sad if you lose your TV while you're watching the football game, right? But TVs are everywhere now. They belong in train stations, in airports, in hospitals, and you could be shutting down parts of critical infrastructure, although they are just TVs.
Yes. So to kind of address both and for the sake of time as well, I think it's a twofold issue that on the one hand, there really needs to be a supply side solution to this, whether it's rules, regulation, preemptive action. We just can't simply operate within the same stance we've been doing this, including for things like items that are compromised en route as part of a supply chain and similar. The other part is that we in general have to really embrace the fact that the internet's a scary and not a very safe place anymore. And all that attack surface management stuff that we've been harping on for years at this point, like it really needs to happen at this point because, you know, who's following the FortiGate, the issue that's been going on today? Just, 70,000 or whatever firewall credentials leaked and such. Like it just, this stuff keeps happening over and over again. And if organizations aren't locking things down preemptively, it's not, it's inviting these sorts of actions to take place as well. So victim side or potential victim side hardening matched with some way of dealing with the problem at a root cause level, like potentially requiring certain items be addressed in order for something to actually access the internet, which gets us to a whole other thorny question of, are we talking about the breakup of the public internet then, and we have regional or countrywide networks instead? Stay tuned for that one.
My very fast question, yes. Just what, like, on the residential proxy side where it's a EULA, it's not that's it, right? It's not malware.
Nope.
You're not going beyond authorized access. You're doing exactly like, what does a policy response to that look like? Like, I look at it and say, is that cool? Like, that's sort of where we have to start, is say,
Right.
actually, normatively, this is wrong, but are there other policy places that you think you should start to have that conversation of, it's not cool to just say, your solitaire app actually will just route traffic wherever someone else that you don't know wants it to go.
Yeah, I mean, we have rules over deceptive and abusive practices already in the commercial space that, I can't, under false pretenses or other concerns or whatever, sign away my house or something like that. Like, there are somewhat rules against these sorts of things. And first off, being aware of it from a policy perspective, that this is not just a thing, but is a serious thing. And then two, how comfortable are we stepping into these markets then to add some degree of both limitation on what can happen and then consequence if and when it does? Does that mean something like what we just saw with the router ban? Maybe, I don't know. Although that's move also has some issues around it as well. But, these things need to be on the table though, because it really is getting out of control.
Joe, it's a small gift.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
All right. Thank you so much.